one more next week. And that's kind of the end, except for May 4th. It takes us, seems like it takes a lot to put it together, and then all of a sudden it's over. I don't know how many of you were here last Thursday. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Scheller was here talking about his video that he had posted on Facebook. I thought it was an excellent class. If you missed it, I encourage you to go back and watch that one, because he really answered some questions for me, questions that I have about the military just in general, and also helped to understand why he did what he did. So go back and watch that. All of our classes are online within 24 hours after the class. So if you know anybody that couldn't be here tonight that wanted to be, let them know that they can watch it tomorrow. Also, I want to thank all of you that have been so generously giving to us. We do run just on donations, so without your help, we can't do what we do. So we appreciate that very much. If you've never been here before, we always pass our red buckets around. Don't feel like you have to put something in, but if you have $1 or $2 that you can contribute, we certainly appreciate it. Also tonight, at some point, I don't know when, I'm sure that our guests will be taking questions, but we'd like to ask you to raise your hand if you have a question and wait for us to bring a microphone to you so that everyone can hear you, including the people online. For those of you online, if you have a question, just go down to the bottom of your screen to the Q&A button, and you can type your question in there. Just want to talk a little bit about the classes we have left that are coming up. On Thursday, we have Dr. Kenneth Mangus, who's going to be here. He's a forensic psychologist. So how many of you watch Forensic Files? Now, I know I can't be the only one. Anyway, that's kind of what it's about. He does go to court and has to testify in the findings, and a lot of his cases take a kind of a twist and a turn. If you haven't watched Forensic Files, you need to watch it so that you really know how that works out. I mean, I'm always really enthralled with it because there's so many cases that would never get solved without the forensics. They always tell you that at the end of the program too. On Saturday, we added a class just a week ago. It's going to be a documentary that we're showing, and it's called Whose Children Are They? We don't have a lot of people signed up for it yet, so we still have plenty of room for you to sign up. It's about what's going on in the schools and what our children are learning. So if you have children in school, if you have kids that have children in school, you need to tell them that they need to see this documentary. I had Glenn Beck on this morning. I didn't catch where he said this was going on, but he actually said there are children in a school now that are identifying themselves as cats and dogs. So I mean, I just can't imagine. He went into it a little bit in depth, but I don't know if that's covered in this documentary, but if it's going on in one school, it's just a matter of time before it's going on in your kid's school. So if you can, sign up for that and come on Saturday morning. Well, the incentive is coffee and donuts, maybe some juice too. Next Tuesday, we have a double header. We have our speaker from the Convention of States, Bill Scott. He's going to be here. That class is going to start at 6:45. So be sure and put that on your calendar. If you come in at 7, you're going to miss some of that. But he will be starting at 6:45, and he's going to be explaining Convention of States. So who in here really wants the federal government running your life and making decisions for you? All of you? No? Yeah. Well, that's a good reason for Convention of States, but he's going to be here. He's going to be telling us where the state of Ohio stands and other states. It takes 38 states to have a Convention of States. I think now is probably one of the most ideal times, if you don't know about it, that you might want to learn about it. Starting at 7:30 that night, Michael Patton, who's a local person here, is going to be talking about Cincinnati and the frontier. I don't know about you, but when I think about the frontier, I think of the Wild, Wild West. But according to Michael, Cincinnati was the Wild West at one time back in the 1700s. And it had treason and fraud, and also had an army, and it had Indians and Indian wars. So everything that you've always seen in the movies and on TV, it all happened here too. So that's on Tuesday. Next Thursday, April 28th, Tom DeWeese from the American Policy Center will be here, and he's going to be talking about the Great Reset. And I know you've all heard of that. If you haven't heard of the Great Reset, I know you've heard of Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, the Green New Deal. They're all the same thing. He's also going to be talking about how COVID plays into the Great Reset. We put out, if you go online, I think there's some copies in the back of the room, but our online class last Thursday was Stuart Scheller. There was some required reading on there, and there's an article, on there about the Great Reset. It was an article that appeared in Hillsdale's Empress. Some of you probably get that, but that's what Tom's going to be telling us about. And he's spoken a little bit about that here before, but of course, things have gotten worse since COVID. So he's going to be tying that all together. We're going to be starting that class at 6 o'clock because we're going to have food and a social hour from 6 to 7. It's going to be limited to 110 people that sign up for in studio. There's no limit to online. So if you want to come, please be sure and sign up for that. And next, I'm going to have Dan Reagan will come up.
Thank you. It's great to have everybody here tonight. Let's do, what do you say how about a giveaway tonight? All right, let's do it. Betty, we've got some great prizes tonight. First of all, I want to thank our sponsor of tonight's class, Diane Landy, and I know she's here. Where's Diane at? Raise your hand, Diane. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Okay, get your tickets out. This is a really good prize. Number 237. 237. Good. Anybody have number 237? Do you really have it? Okay. Dave is the winner of a $50 gift card to White Oak Gardens. Let's give him a round of applause. Congratulations. And our online winner, we've got a great book for her tonight. It's great to see so many people online tonight. Welcome here. This book is really going to be interesting, The Rise and the Fall of the Secret Service. It's called Zero Fail, and the winner of that online is Melissa S. So let's give Melissa a round of applause. Thank you. And while we're at it, Betty Overstreet, our great executive director, give her a round of applause. Thank you, Betty. I want to acknowledge our friend Chris Monzel, who's in the audience tonight. Chris Monzel, welcome. We are always glad to have you with us at EmpowerU. How many people have never been to an EmpowerU class before? A few. Gosh, it's great to see so many people. So these classes, it's a simple idea to help you become more empowered in your lives. That's the mission of EmpowerU. And the way we want to try to do that is by teaching you free classes to educate, help you enjoy, and get engaged in important topics like the kind that you're going to hear about tonight. One of the most important topics, I'm going to talk a little bit about it more in a minute, is a movie we're going to be showing on Saturday morning early at 9 o'clock. It's a 2-hour movie. It's called Whose Children Are They? Right in this studio. And I really encourage you to think about coming. And one of our board members, Leah Cagle, is going to come up and talk about the movie real quick. And we're going to show you the trailer. And Bill Roll, would you be able to turn all the lights off when we show that trailer? Leah, come on up. Let's give Leah a round of applause too.
Parents love and care for their children. That sentiment was on full display in 1984 when hundreds of parents traveled to one of 7 cities to give testimony on what they discovered in their children's schools. This was 1984. Parents courageously used their free voices to call out psychological abuse of children in public schools. They use their voices to call out illiteracy, teen suicide, loneliness, depression, teenage sex, pregnancies, how schools are alienating children from their parents, from morality and our American heritage. Does that sound familiar? That was 1984, 38 years ago. Their heroism brought about change. It brought about new regulation to enforce the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment. The protection of pupil rights is an important civil rights issue. It was then, it is today. It's key to the prevention of child abuse. What parents are finding today, parents saw then. The effects of psychological abuse is hurting children, and the documentary will help parents, concerned citizens understand that better, give you more detail, help you identify what's happening, how it's happening, the background, and what parents, concerned citizens, voters, everyone can do to prevent child abuse. My name is Leah Cagle. I'm one of the hosts on Saturday. I'm hosting the event on Saturday. There'll be a 1-hour open discussion. Everyone is welcome. Opposing views, experiences, questions. If you're living the nightmare, you can come to learn you're not alone.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you. Let's watch the trailer.
Public education has gone off the rails.
Now it's about power and money and politics, and somehow the kids are getting lost in all of that.
It doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you're a mom and a dad first.
Critical race theory is dividing our children in ways that are unacceptable.
You cannot use racism to eradicate racism.
Our teachers are bullied. Parents are shut out.
Less than 1/3 of America's school children are proficient in anything.
They're teaching these kids X-rated sex acts.
When we look at this radical agenda, the way our children are being exploited and the way parents are getting shut out, it comes down to one fundamental question. Whose children are they?
Whose children are they?
¿De quién son esos niños?
Whose children are they?
And Leah's been very involved in helping us get this movie to be here Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. Let's give her another round of applause. Thank you. Thank you, Leah. Just a couple things I wanted, yeah. It will not be virtual. It is only here at the studio. Thank you for asking that. Just a couple things I wanted to go over before we get started. I wanted to introduce you to our great team that we have that has worked so hard on this semester. It's been so great. We've got, and since we've got our treasurer, Bill Roll, in the back. We've got, give him a round of applause. We've got Jay Grunke, who's producing tonight. We've got some of our great board members here today. We've got Barb Horwitz right here in the third row. Barb, raise your hand. And Ken Bowman right here. And I don't know, I'm probably missing a few other people. But so last Thursday's night's class with Stuart Scheller, it was fascinating to me because essentially what he did, he boiled down his whole talk about the Afghanistan withdrawal simply by telling us that the reason it happened is that we've got a bunch of suck-ups in the upper ranks of the US military that are scared to tell their bosses what's happening. And he was so clear in his thinking about what had happened, and the crowd was, I think it's safe to say, appreciative to him. If that's the kind of class you're interested in, you can go on EmpowerUamerica.org and watch the replay of the class. It was incredible. As some of you know, I always have a little bit of required reading for you to do some work outside of class. There was a line in that trailer, I don't know if any of you heard it, that maybe you thought was hyperbole about children and sex acts. And maybe a couple of you thought, not really. Well, I was up in Cleveland today. Jay, could you throw that slide up on the board? Hopefully we'll be able to get it. I was up today in Cleveland visiting two incredibly great people, John and Diane Stover, who run a group called the Ohio Value Voters, and they protect Ohio children. Essentially, they've got one mission in life, and that's to stop our kids from being indoctrinated. So he testified before the State Board of Education last week, and this is just a wild one. It's hard to believe, but he testified that he had found out about a group called INF Ohio, INF Ohio, and essentially what this group was doing, they run a portal that a lot of the kids in public education have access to. And on this portal, the kids, if they were smart to get through a couple links, would be able to get through to hardcore pornography. And the link on the website, if you want to watch it, you can watch his testimony and you can see how there were a few people that were shocked, but there were a few people that just, hey, you know, it didn't seem like a big deal to them. I encourage you to watch it because it may change your mind about what's going on in schools. They were incredible people. The other required reading article we've got that we'll actually hand out to you when you leave tonight is our guest Vivek's last, I think it's his last editorial in the Wall Street Journal, Blackrock's Climate Crusade Double Talk. So you can pick this up on your way out the door. So I want to introduce our guest for tonight. Vivek Ramaswamy founded Roivant Sciences, a biopharmaceutical company, in 2014 after a career as a successful biotech investor. A 36-year-old first-generation American, he's a graduate of Harvard and Yale Law School. Vivek became a hedge fund partner in his 20s and grew up the child of immigrants in the small town of Evendale, Ohio. And I know there's a lot of Evendale people here today. Becky, my wife's here tonight. She is making a rare appearance. Let's give her a round of applause. It's good to see all you Evendale people here. So Vivek took on the nation last year and published his book, Woke Inc., which is just so great. And that book essentially takes you behind the scenes of corporate boardrooms and begins to be critical of stakeholder capitalism. Vivek serves on several boards as a graduate of St. X High School and has recently been turning heads on many shows that you've seen him on, Tucker Carlson, on writing in the Wall Street Journal and several other places. My wife, Becky, and I think we met Vivek when we lived 17 years ago in Evendale, when he went to school with my daughter, and our families played tennis, and he was a tennis player. And when I would see him over at the Queen City Racquet Club, just a mile away from here, and I would see the look and the passion on his face and how hard he played. It isn't hard for me to understand how he's so passionate about all the subjects he's going to talk to you about tonight. And some more Evendale, great people. Evendale people are great. And I wanted to share this one story that my wife reminded me of. I hope this won't embarrass Vivek at all. But so it got to be the end of the class year in 6th grade, elementary school. 8th grade, okay, I'm off a couple of years, 8th grade. And, you know, all the kids went to the award ceremony, you know, where everybody gets their awards, and all the kids were dressed up and they thought they were going to win best student and they were going to do this or do that. And as they started to read the award ceremony off, every winner was Ramaswamy. and which the kids were all, and Vivek, I thought to myself, if, you know, if Ohio that many years ago would have been like it is today, and everything is based on equity, you would have only won one award that night. And it would have been maybe a much different life for you, Vivek. See? So with that in mind, it is so great to welcome Vivek Ramaswamy to EmpowerU.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. Thank you, Dan, for that kind introduction. And we were chatting beforehand. I mean, I love being in this room. I'm glad Dan put this together. We've been talking about doing this for the last year. I've known about this print shop actually back from when I was growing up as their neighbor in Evendale. So it's a pleasure to come back. But for me, I think rather than giving you a big, long speech, I'm going to just kick it off with a couple of remarks that are off the top of my head here, things that are on my mind this week, and use that as a bridge to really start a conversation that I hope we can really make this a bit more interactive. And we'll use a microphone for those of you who are in the room so everyone online is able to hear you. But I thought that's how it might have a little more fun this evening than just have you captive for a big, long speech. I will say that as I viewed that video, whose children are they? It made me think about a parallel theme that I've been thinking a lot about in recent months. It relates to what I'm working on next in my life, which is also the question of whose money is it that's in your retirement account or your savings account or your brokerage account or your 401k account. And I think that might be where I focus a couple of my remarks in kicking the discussion off tonight, where you might see a lot of things happen in the world, in corporate America, that might cause you to scratch your head a little bit. I talk about a bunch of those examples in the book, but it feels like I have to write a revised edition of the book every week because every week gives us new fodder for new examples. Adidas's embrace of a new transgender man bragging about his feat of defeating all of the other women in a new ad campaign that Adidas ran a few weeks ago. I just wonder what they're doing to really increase the size of their market share reach amongst female athletes by telling them that actually they're going to be dwarfed in competition by a recently converted transgender man. This is a little bit puzzling. A big one recently was, of course, Disney, which you guys are probably familiar with in recent weeks, made a decision that alienated 60% of its customer base. And the decision they made was to go on a national crusade against legislation that was similar to that was passed in Florida. So in Florida, they passed this bill. It's called the Parental Rights in Education Act. Some of you may have heard of it described in the media as the so-called Don't Say Gay bill. Basically, the upshot of the bill is that for kids in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade, they wanted to restrict teaching them about sexual orientation and about gender identity and about topics relating to sex more generally. So as I joked around on Fox when I was asked about this, I don't like having to name every law according to a rhyme, but if you had to pick a rhyme for this one, you might have been better served to call it wait till 8. That's effectively what the bill says. Wait till you're 8 years old. That's a closer description of what the law said rather than don't say gay. But anyway, the curious thing about the state of Florida is that they passed this law, but their largest corporation doing business in the state of Florida, Disney, has pledged to repeal the law in Florida. This is literally what Disney said. We pledged to repeal the law. An interesting feature of that is Disney's a company. It's not a lawmaker. So how can a company repeal a law? That might be a question that you ask yourself. But not only did they not stop there, they decided to actually commit to a national crusade to prevent legislation like that passing in other states across the country. There's actually a similar bill pending here in Ohio. And furthermore, that they've committed to also making sure that they were advancing the LGBTQ+ identity through the characters that they would be introducing into their films coming out over the course of the next several years. So this is a bit of a head scratcher because a group called the Daily Wire did a survey of Disney's customers. It was a widespread survey, and it turns out a majority of Disney's customers are Democrats. Many are independent and many are Republican, but the highest number by political affiliation were Democrat, but it didn't matter for the purpose of results of the survey. Over 60%, I think the number was close to 2/3 of Disney's customers, strongly disagreed with Disney's position on the matter. So that gets you back to the head scratcher of asking yourself why it is the CEO of Disney, a $200+ billion company, would make a decision that would alienate over 60% of his customer base. And I will share some facts with you. Traffic in Disney's theme parks has actually gone down in recent weeks on the back of this. So this is happening. It's puzzling a little bit. It might make you wonder what's going on. So some people, friends of mine in other authors, right-wing media, conservative commentary, political commentators, they have pointed to the fact that this CEO lacks a spine in making his decisions because he bent the knee to literally fewer than 200 employees. It might have been fewer than 100 employees who demanded that he take a course of action that alienate him from his customer base. But to me, that never really made entire sense. I want to scratch a little bit beneath the surface and take you to the inside of what's really going on. Now, I'm not saying that he lacks, that this is a courageous CEO, or that these commentators were wrong about the fact that Disney's CEO, was cowardly in bending the knee to internal employees. Maybe that's part of the story, but it's not the entire story, okay? He might do that for some type of cheap virtue signaling, but he's not going to alienate 60% of his customer base on the back of what 20 employees asked him to do, no matter where he is in the political spectrum. That struck me as really unlikely. Well, that actually led me to take a look at asking the question of who are Disney's top shareholders. So Disney's a publicly traded company, trades on the stock exchange, and that means any one of you, probably many of us in this room, directly or indirectly, have Disney in our portfolios. So the question is, who end up being the top shareholders of Disney? Turns out it isn't the CEO. It isn't anyone who sits on the board. It isn't someone from the Disney family. It isn't Bob Iger. It isn't Bob Chapek, who's the CEO of Disney today. The top three shareholders of Disney are three firms by the name of Blackrock, State Street, and Vanguard. I believe in that order. Okay, those are the three largest asset managers in the United States. Together, they manage over $20 trillion. That is more than the GDP of the United States government, the United States nation. GDP is about $20 trillion. They manage collectively well over $20 trillion. Over half of that is BlackRock alone. And what they're doing is they're buying up shares in nearly every company in corporate America. In fact, every one of the companies in the S&P 500, those are generally the 500 largest publicly traded companies in the US, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard own at least 20%, and in some cases over 30% of every one of those companies. And what they're doing is actually telling those companies to do the same things as the millennial and Gen Z employees are demanding of their CEO. So now you put yourself back in the position of Bob Chapek, the CEO of a $200 billion company, and he has a decision to make. There's a controversial law in Florida. The media has flagged Disney's potential involvement in it, and he has to make a decision. And yes, it's true, he has 100 employees protesting internally at his corporate headquarters, but he's not just listening to them. He's also listening to his top shareholders, the people he reports to as a CEO. And he realizes that not only the employees who are reporting to him are demanding him to take a course of action, his problem runs a lot deeper than that. Effectively, the people who are the top shareholders of his company, the people who he's supposed to work for, his bosses, are also telling him to do the same thing. And that's really where this dilemma actually begins. If we just stop at being frustrated and throwing our hands in the air at CEOs who lack the courage to lead their employees or suffer from the paradox of parents who want to be friends with their kids, it's like a CEO who wants to be friends with their employees. It doesn't work that way. It's not just that. It's the idea that you're actually in a bind as a CEO when your own bosses are telling you to do the same thing. See, Milton Friedman, I talk about this in my book. Milton Friedman, many of you know of him or have heard of him. He's now long past, but back in 1970, wrote a famous essay in the New York Times, which said that the social purpose of a corporation is to pursue profit. Where he said the job of a corporation is to generate profits for its shareholders. And it was in response to the Milton Friedman dogma that we saw the rise of stakeholder capitalism, or ESG, all of which falls under the rubric of the Great Reset, which I'll talk a little bit about and you'll hear more about in the coming weeks, it sounds like. But what they've been able to do on the other side of this debate is actually take the Milton Friedman narrative and turn it upside down, where Milton Friedman might have said that, actually, I don't want you, the corporation, pushing a social ideology through your corporate activities onto your customers and onto our society, because businesses should focus on the essence of what businesses do. Make products and services for people who need them, do a good job of that, make a profit, and do nothing else. Do that for your shareholders, because if you don't, the business is going to be less efficient and your shareholders are going to make less money. And if your shareholders make less money, then that's going to create a smaller economic pie for everybody else. That was the Milton Friedman argument. What's happened in the last 10 years is the other side has turned that argument on its head by actually saying that, no. We are the shareholders. And we're telling you that we demand that you mix your business objectives with these social agendas that we need to push in order to, in their vision, make the world a better place. Fight systemic racism through systemic usage of racial quotas. Fight climate change by adopting self-adopted private emissions on your private caps on your carbon emissions that result in higher prices for consumer goods. But that's the only single right way to fight climate change. We, the shareholders, are demanding that you, the corporation, do it, which completely blunts the argument that you should do this for the interests of shareholders, because those very shareholders are the ones telling you that they're demanding, as your boss, as CEO, that you must adopt these ideologies. That's what's actually going on in the Disney case. That's what's exactly going on in the case of Nike, in the case of every other major corporation in America. So you might ask yourself why it wasn't the case that Universal Studios didn't seize on that like a business opportunity, because people have already stopped the traffic from going to Disney. You might think that if you're the CEO of Universal Studios, you would say that, hey, if you're coming to Florida for vacation, let me tell you about our business. We don't believe in advancing a political ideology and foisting that on your children. We're a politics-free zone. Come to Universal Studios. There's no doubt their sales would have skyrocketed at the ticket box. And by the way, not just at their theme parks, but for their movies too. Well, that got me curious to take a look at, I wonder what the ownership of Universal Studios looks like. So it turns out Universal Studios has two parent companies. One is NBC Universal and one is Comcast. NBC Universal is owned by GE, which leads me to look at who are the top shareholders of GE. Guess who the top shareholders of GE are? Blackrock, State Street, and Vanguard. And then I look at who their partner is. Their partner's Comcast. And I ask, man, who are some of the top shareholders of Comcast? It's Blackrock, State Street, and Vanguard. So Universal Studios isn't going to jump on an obvious opportunity that exists for Universal Studios themselves to jump on, even though they can make more money by doing it, even though their customers are demanding that they are begging for somebody to step in and fill this void. They're not doing it. You call that free market capitalism. The way it's supposed to work is if one competitor flubs, somebody else steps into the void and actually captures the opportunity. That's the capitalism that you and I understand. That's not the capitalism of the world in which there's a managerial class that's actually advancing governmental left-wing interests through the vehicle of the private market. That's actually coordinated market behavior, kind of like you might have thought about monopolists like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie carrying out with consumer pricing practices in the 1800s. This is the ideological equivalent of that in the modern day. So then you think about, okay, let me go to the next one down the list. Okay, there's Disney, there's Universal Studios, they're not doing it. Let's look at Paramount Pictures. Their parent company's Paramount Global. They have theme parks. Kings Island right here is actually owned by Paramount. So I call it, Paramount Kings Island. They also make movies. Who are the top shareholders of Paramount Global? This is going to start getting old. Same companies, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. They show up as the shareholders and tell each of these companies that this is the ideology you have to push or else. So this illusion of the free market that's supposed to address the problem through competition does not exist today. And while in 1980, it might have been a nice idea to say that we're going to solve these problems through market competition. And by the way, I used to, I didn't always identify as a conservative. I used to identify as a libertarian. Part of the reason I moved on from that is that the free market that we idealize as classical conservatives and libertarians, that free market does not exist today. And the market that exists today is actually a hybrid of both big government and big business that together has created this new monster that is far more powerful than either one alone. Now, here's where it breaks down, is that BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, when they show up in Disney, when they show up at NBC Universal, when they show up at GE, at Comcast, at Universal Studios, at Paramount Global, and say that we're the shareholder, brings me back to the question that I was thinking about as it related to the documentary that you're about to watch. Whose children are they? Whose money actually is it? Who really is the shareholder? And it turns out that actually they're not the shareholder. You know who the shareholders of those companies are? It's the people in this room, actually. So What's really happening is they're aggregating your money, our money, through a Plinko chip. You ever watch Price is Right? It's like a Plinko, it's like the game of Plinko. You drop the chip over here and you think it's going to land straight down below where it's going to go, but it's actually through the Plinko chip system. It still ends up in the same 3 buckets at the end of the day. Blackrock, State Street, and Vanguard. It lands in those buckets. And what they're doing is they're using your money to aggregate $20 trillion to show up in the boardrooms of corporate America to tell them to do what would make your own blood boil if you actually knew what was going on. It is the greatest fraud in modern American history. It's not even just a fraud on your money. It's a fraud on your identity, on your personhood, actually. And it's hiding in plain sight, but no one's really woken up to it yet. And I think that's the quiet, cynical force behind the scene. Where I talk a lot about woke culture in my book, and I'm no proponent of critical race theory in the schools or in corporate America or in modern American life. But here's what I'll say. Let's take somebody authentic on the other side, a former professor or classmate of mine from Yale Law School or wherever else, who has just very different views, believes America is a systemically racist nation, believes we need to correct it through quota systems. I reject the narrative of systemic racism, and I reject the use of racial quota systems today. But let's just say there were 2 people who authentically believe it. At least we're going to be able to have that debate out in the open and settle our questions the old-fashioned way, through free speech and open debate in the public square as citizens. And we may agree, we may disagree, but we're still bound together by at least our commitment to do that as citizens, because that's part of what it means to be American. That's part of what it means to be a citizen in a democracy. We don't always have to agree, but that's how we settle our differences. What this new model has really done to that vision of citizenship is it has perverted it through this cynical model where dollars are actually settling that normative debate, that debate that you ought to have as citizens together. They're using economic force to settle the debate instead. And I often, think about what does it mean to live in a democracy? Well, I think one of the things, one of the features of living in a democratic nation, in a democratic republic, is that it is a society that settles its political questions through free speech and open debate rather than through the use of force. And what we're seeing today is the use of economic force to settle questions that we instead should settle together as citizens. And then the cherry on top is it's not even using someone else's economic force to settle the question. It's using your own hard-earned dollars and savings to settle the questions in ways that would make your blood boil if you actually knew what was going on. And that brings me even to the news of the last week, where you watch Elon Musk try to take over Twitter. He puts in a bid. He's the wealthiest man in the world, worth about $200 billion. It's a lot of money to take a 9% stake in a company that is now going to do everything in its power to prevent him from buying the company, even though that's going to result in greater dollars for shareholders. If you own shares of Twitter and they accept the deal that Elon Musk offers them, and you were a shareholder of Twitter, let's say this January, you'd make 50% on your money at a time where we've had a war in Ukraine break out and a lot of the stock market's broken since then. That's a pretty good deal, okay? They're going to do everything they can to prevent him from buying the company, where the board of directors of Twitter, comprised of what I call the managerial class. It's the same managerial class in the federal government that staffs the private sector. That managerial class is going to say, they already did, they said no. They've adopted a measure called a poison pill that prevents him from, it penalizes him that if he buys above 15% of the shares of Twitter, the value of all of his shares go to zero. So he spends billions of dollars, but if he spends $1 more than owning 15%, they've passed a new corporate measure that says his shares value will go to zero. It's an aggressive and arguably illegal tactic, in my opinion. But at the end of the day, you should be able to sue those shareholders, those boards of directors as shareholders, because they owe you a fiduciary duty to maximize value. But you know who's going to give them cover is the people who the shareholder register shows is their actual top shareholders. So actually owning more stock than Elon Musk and Twitter today is still Vanguard, and not far behind him are State Street, Blackrock, and in this case, Morgan Stanley, who are going to, as the shareholders, say that actually they're making the right decision anyway to turn down this offer because that's what we want to see them do, even though actually the people whose money they're managing would benefit both financially and see a future vision for the company that better represents their values, betrayed by the people who are supposed to owe them a duty to actually represent their interests. So that's how deep this game runs. And I think that this is not actually a theme I focused on much in my book. I'm happy, in the Q&A to talk more about themes that come out of my book over the last couple of years, which relate to some of the more philosophical issues underlying this debate. But I think this is a really practical element that I've focused my attention on since writing the book, as I think about how to change this situation for the better, not just to describe the problem, but how to pave the path to a better way forward. And I think it starts with people taking control over what is already theirs. I think there's one version of this that we saw beginning to play out in the country over the course of the last year, taking control of their children's education. Again, whose children are they? It's a good question to ask. They're your children. And at the end of the day, once they turn 18, they're nobody's children because they're not children anymore. But until they're 18, they're your children. And that's something that I think parents across this country woke up to over the course of the pandemic. It probably is the single greatest positive effect of the pandemic in the United States was parents waking up to the answer to that question. And I think the next frontier for us to wake up to as a movement in this country, and I use the word movement, I don't mean conservative movement, I mean American movement in this country, is to wake up to the fact that it's also your money. It's also your hard-earned savings. It's also your well-deserved investment dollars that belong to you. And if you're going to hand it over to somebody else as a custodian to invest those dollars for you, you can do that. That's great. That might be a perfectly fine decision, but make darn sure that they're not voting your shares or exercising a voice on your behalf that actually betrays the values that you fight for and by which you live on a daily basis. That's my advice to you. So thank you. So with that, we'll open it up for some Q&A and make this a conversation.
Who's got a question for Vivek right here?
Hey, Vivek, I'm Will and live in Glendale down the road here. Thanks so much for being here. Question for you. Everything that you just said and Woke Geek is spot on. Do you think with the left controlling the news media, the media, Hollywood, music, ESPN, the colleges, the high schools now, sadly, do you think our one asset is we still have 50% of the country, basically, give or take. What are your thoughts about an overall boycott? You take a show like The View or ABC Nightly News, one of these things. We have half this country. Conservatives tend not to want to boycott products. What's your theory on that?
So that's a great question. I think there's one missing link here I think is worth describing. So I'll first answer the question in the terms you asked it, including in right and left terms. I'll then answer the question in ways that go beyond partisanship as well. So when we look at it in terms of right and left, I actually think the wrong way to look at it is just numbers of people, because it understates the opportunity. When I look at this through an economic lens, it's actually looking at where the buying power resides. And if you just take even the partisan labels off for a second, there's over 100 to 150 million Americans, about half the adults in this country, who are badly put off by the merger of progressive politics and big business. But it's not just half of the adults. When you actually adjust that for buying power, for savings, for people who are hard workers, don't lie in their credit card applications, don't lie on their insurance claims, net savers, hard workers, these are actually some of the most attractive customers that any business could actually wish for. It actually adds up on my math to being close to the fourth or third largest economy in the world, just in the United States, an American version of that. And I'm not talking much about this tonight, although I can if you guys have questions. There's actually a very equivalent version of this problem in Western Europe and in Canada and in Australia and even in India and in Japan. It's a feature of modern democracies around the world. We're seeing the same thing. This is actually a transnational issue, even more than just an American issue. But it turns out that the 50% who reject the orthodoxy of progressive politics being merged with business happen to have way more than 50% of the buying power and investment power. And so that brings me to the second question of whether I think boycotts are a successful approach. And I don't like using the word boycott because it misses one element of the chain that we have to kind of fill in before the problem is solved, which is actually alternatives in the marketplace that don't really exist today. And this is where it's going to take, I would say, brave, audacious, daring business leaders, entrepreneurs, and CEOs to step up and capture what I think is the defining economic opportunity of our generation, to go after those 100 to 150 million Americans with products and services and messages that actually match and respect their own values. Nobody has really started to do that in a serious way today. One-offs here and there a little bit, but nobody's really started to do that in a serious way. And I'll tell you, I went to Harvard in 2003 to 2007. Mark Zuckerberg was a year ahead of me. I will give him credit as a business opportunity spotter and as a capitalist for spotting kind of one of these once in a generation opportunities. Okay. Back then it was how social media, how the internet could use somebody's clicking behavior to open up insight into the essence of what resides in their soul, to learn more about them from the outside based on how they click than they know about themselves, which was the backbone of creating a $1 trillion advertising behemoth in the form of not only Facebook, but other companies that followed in their wake. Now, trillions of dollars in value were created on the back of it. I don't know that that's actually been good for society. My own views is that social media mostly hasn't, but put that to one side. I think we're at one of those kinds of seismic defining opportunities today where I think there's going to be a generation of $1 trillion companies built on the back of servicing in a respectful way, being the steward of the 100 million people who actually have buying power equivalent to the scale of the fourth or third largest economy in the world that nobody is going after today. Like Blackrock, State Street, and Vanguard, that alternative doesn't exist. Actually, literally, if you wanted to take your funds out and put it somewhere that you could reliably know your shares were voted in ways that align with your own values, that does not exist today. And the same thing with respect to alternatives to Twitter, for that matter, in social media, or alternatives to Nike in the marketplace for sneakers. Mostly that doesn't exist today. To Disney in the marketplace for theme parks. But I think that we're going to, in the next few years, see a generation of entrepreneurs and CEOs view that as an opportunity so big they can't ignore it. And then I would frame it less as a boycott, but less as a migration, an economic migration towards companies that are actually going to be more successful. And then, look, is that going to be good for the country? I'm just going to be really transparent with you. I don't know is the answer. I really don't know whether that's going to, the Mark Zuckerberg thing 20 years later, I think I can say with the benefit of retrospect, it mostly was not good for the country. Will this be good for the country? I actually don't know, because I think that it could be a really bad thing to end up having a bifurcated economy where we have a red economy and a blue economy for everything. To the extent we have seen it, we've already seen a red coffee and a blue coffee, Black Rifle and Starbucks. We've seen, Republican pillows and Democratic pillows. If we get to Republican baseball and Democratic baseball, I think we're in a pretty bad spot as a country. And that's not where I actually want to see this go. But the good version of it will be if we get to a place where after you steal 1 million customers at a time from Disney and Nike and Blackrock, et cetera, what I hope for is them to wake up 5 years from now or 10 years from now and say that, you know what, our approach to diversity and inclusion was not as diverse and inclusive as we thought it was, and we're going to rethink our approach. That might be actually the good version of it and seeing our culture come back. But as a predictive matter, that's what I see coming.
Let's take another question.
My name is Leslie. Just a couple comments, and trying to get the kind of nomenclature and semantics down. Is what you explained about the primary shareholders in Disney, et cetera, would you call that woke capitalism?
Woke capitalism is a really broad term that's often overused. So I generally don't use that expression.
Okay.
Because it just refers to a lot of different things.
Yeah.
So I'll sort of give you a quick brief. If you went to Harvard Business School, one of the things they would teach you is one of the corporate governance struggles in the 1980s, and ever since public companies started going public, was the so-called separation of ownership and control of businesses. So the separation of control from ownership. So this was a concern where most businesses were like, a business like what Dan's built here across the country. You had a proprietor who's built a business from scratch, who runs that business and can keep very close eyes on that business because he owns it and he's also running it. Well, what happened is companies started getting bigger, and as they started going public, was that the people who were running the companies were different from the people who owned the companies, who were the shareholders of those companies. And so back in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, this was the subject of like a lot of corporate law scholarship, was how you get the CEOs of the companies to actually be responsive to their shareholders. And there's a lot of ways in which those problems have been fixed. You have annual director meetings, You can ultimately fire the CEO as shareholders. A lot of the private equity industry was built on this, hostile takeovers of companies that were run poorly. So that's how that whole situation played out. The 2020 version of this that started after the 2008 financial crisis was a different problem. It wasn't the separation of ownership from control of the businesses. It's now what I call, and actually I think one of the Delaware Chancery Court judges called it this, it is the separation of ownership from ownership, actually. So the people who claim to be the shareholders, the owners, who the CEOs are supposed to report to, that all of modern corporate law was built on giving actually the power back to those shareholders. The people who claim to be those shareholders aren't the actual shareholders. So it's a different problem that, it took 30 years to solve the CEO versus shareholders problem. But now we have a different problem that corporate law and policymaking has not caught up to, which is the people who pretend to be the shareholders aren't really the shareholders. And it turns out that class of people, the people who run Blackrock, State Street, Vanguard, people like Larry Fink, the CEO of Blackrock, who I think is sort of ground zero for this problem, they're advancing, they're using it to advance these political agendas that, like, let's say you give your money to a financial advisor, you and I would both agree, I think nearly I could find 10 people in America who would disagree with this, that he can't take money from your piggy bank, from your account, and donate it to his high school. Let's say it was me. I can't do that and donate it to St. X High School. Or I can't donate it to the Hindu Temple of Cincinnati, where my family worships here. No, there's just something wrong about using a client's funds to subsidize your high school or your temple. Well, that's effectively what they're doing, just subsidizing a different temple instead, the temple of BLM, the temple of climate change, the temple of DEI, the temple of capital diversity. And so that's a different problem than the sort of the CEO versus shareholder problem. This is a shareholder versus the real shareholder problem. And nobody's really woken up to that problem yet, which is why I'm so focused on it.
Interesting. The other just quick follow-up. I'm just seeing this idea, and I've heard it more called a parallel economy, is just beginning to get some traction. We certainly see it in the media with all these new media companies that have sprung up. I'm helping to start a new magazine that focuses on the dignity of the human person. So it's the flip side of all this crazy gender ideology stuff. So it's a magazine from a Christian worldview of who are we created we are created in the image and likeness of God, and therefore that ought to steer the way we behave in the world. And I was talking to a possible investor, and his comment to me just last week, was like, this is a really interesting idea. And with the emergence of this parallel economy, there may be a large market of people who would be interested in what you're doing.
There is.
Yeah.
I just encourage everyone in this room, we're going to see that parallel economy. It's coming. I hope, and I believe most of you hope, that it will be done in a way that's good for the country and doesn't lead us to permanent bifurcation. But time will tell, and I think it depends on which kinds of leaders step up.
Let's take another question right here.
Hi, my name is Paul, and until I read your book, I didn't know that you were aware of Professor Philip Hamburg.
Yeah.
But it's a topic that I find very intriguing because he claims, of course, administrative law is unconstitutional, which it is, because regulations are administrative law, and regulations are the implementing portion of legislation. Well, DeSantis just announced today that he was going to try to get a bill before the legislature of Florida to repeal Disney World's home rule. And home rule for Disney has given them a pass on all the regulations that the state of Florida has passed. And of course, I never realized that there was such a capability within the state to be able to get a waiver, if you will, from the legislature. But he's going to try to change that, and hopefully he can. But I'm hoping that you might just get it on the federal level, where Philip Hamburg's argument about administrative judges are not real judges. They're just civil servants.
So for people who don't know the individual you're referring to, he's a Columbia University law professor. I'm a big fan of his work. I've spoken to him in recent months as well. He basically argues that the administrative state is an unlawful creation. I mostly agree with him. I'll refer you today to a further problem beyond the administrative state, is the alphabet soup of not just the deep state, but what I call deep corporate as well. And it's part of what I call a waterfall of political accountability, where the original solution to resolving political dilemmas that our founding fathers envisioned is that our elected leaders would debate them in the open. They would pass laws if they mustered enough votes to pass those laws. And if we, the people, did not like the laws they passed, we would vote them out to replace them with other people who would pass different laws instead. Well, the state then realized that they could actually sidestep that process by delegating as much authority as possible away from Congress and from the US Senate towards the creation of the alphabet soup of the administrative state. FTC, SEC, FDA, NIH, DIA, DOJ, FAA, it just goes on, right? It's the alphabet soup of the federal government. And administrative law, there's a principle called the non-delegation doctrine, which said that actually Congress can't delegate to the administrative state what is supposed to be constitutionally Congress's problem. So this was a 1980s thing. Ronald Reagan, this was one of his core issues to sort of make government smaller, more accountable, attack the administrative state, correctly so in my opinion. Today that we're seeing a separate step to the waterfall, where now the administrative state, the alphabet soup of the federal government, is now actually delegating their work to a new alphabet soup comprised of FB, GOOG, MSFT, AAPL, AMZN. This is the new alphabet soup in the private sector and the deep corporate apparatus within it that today is able to do through the back door, Twitter, through the back door, what government could not do through the front door under the Constitution, censoring content that even the administrative state couldn't censor, because everyone knows we have this thing called the First Amendment that we're told doesn't apply to private companies. Yeah, it doesn't apply to private companies, but maybe it should if those private companies are being instrumentalized by the government to do its dirty work through disguise. So that's where my focus is.
Another question right here.
Hi, my name is David. I do a lot of research in stocks also, what you were talking about. But what really disturbed me was all these retirement unions in California, teachers unions, how they're getting their agenda done through the stocks. Like, I own Exxon Mobil, and how they're moving away from that with their political climate change stuff and buying in these other companies. How are we to adjust for all these states? Because they're talking trillions of dollars.
So this is where I'm going to ask for your all's help, actually. I was evaluating personally career in politics versus nonprofits. Where was it going to have an impact? I think doing it through the market might be the most important next frontier. So I think someone should focus on creating an alternative Disney. Someone else should focus on creating an alternative Nike. I'm focused on creating an alternative Blackrock, because I think that it actually starts at the top with the trickle-down effect. So here's some of the challenges associated with doing it. I'll just tell you from where I sit so that you could sort of decide how you want to take action. Where I sit is, let's say we're meeting with a pension fund board member or a state treasurer. They're going to say, oh, I think my constituents want this, but you know what? It's not my job to make that decision. And we've already done this for the last 10 years in going with Blackrock and State Street and Vanguard. That's how they got their assets. They say, you know what? We don't want to be political in making a decision based on responding to a political concern, because at the end of the day, we already have a comfort level with people who we've done business with. Now, how do they get there? BlackRock's effectively bought off the system, have actually been able to manage to really pay people to be able to have paved that way over the last 10 years of carving the channels that cause dollars to flow in their direction. But actually what they fail to realize is they are already making a political decision today. The political decision has already been made. And if anything, the thing we're asking for is not to make an alternative political decision, but to actually make a non-political decision, to say that actually your message to companies should be not to advance political agendas through your companies, but just to pursue excellence in your own products and services, period. And so what I think I'd like to see the country wake up to, maybe starting with the people in this room, is just as parents woke up to recognizing that school boards were betraying the duties they had to their children after years of ignoring those school boards, now to pay attention to the very same thing for who's on the board of your pension fund. Who is your state treasurer? Why aren't they actually being responsive to your interests? Why is that status quo bias just because they made mistakes 10 years ago, somehow justifying the mistakes that they continue to make today? That's the managerial class at the intersection of the public and private sector. And it's not a Republican or Democrat issue. I think Republicans and Democrats are worse, but Republicans are guilty of this problem too. And until there's actually a political cost to them to be able to deviate from the status quo, they're going to ultimately stick to the current status quo. So I think that's ultimately going to be a task for the everyday citizen, starting with people in this room. And when you go back next week, figure out who your pension fund managers are, figure out who those board members are, and make sure they're hearing from you that you're not happy if your money is going to index fund managers that are voting your shares in ways that you disagree with. That'd be a first step. And I think you are, sticking to the theme of the evening, empowered actually to be able to do
So
that.
Vivek, are you saying that we should each kick in $10 and be the initial shareholders in this venture tonight?
Yeah,
Get the red buckets out, Bill.
Yeah.
We've got
we brought a, can you put them in this bucket right here?
Yeah, I could print some share certificates. We've got a question right here.
Yeah, my name's David and I'm a proud Princeton High School grad. So I've spent some time in Evendale along the way. So read your book in full and I truly recommend everybody to get a copy, mark it up, and you can use it as a real textbook kind of thing. So congratulations on the book. We look forward to the next one. Okay. My question is, toward the end of the book, you talk about shared national identity and a way of bringing people together. And could you expand on that, on things that we can potentially do to bring that shared national identity, find those items to make those happen?
That's great. I mean, I do think that one of the things that we ought to do better in our side of the aisle, of the political aisle, even if you are to divide it into two, is that we're sometimes really good at criticizing the other side. But I think the harder work that we as conservatives, I think, need to take it upon ourselves to really rise to a higher challenge is to fill this void of national identity in an entire generation. Even the woke movement, even much of the progressive movement is born of really well-intentioned impulses that start with people my age and younger, millennials, Gen Z, who want to make a difference in the world, who are hungry for a cause, for a sense of purpose and identity and meaning, that don't have that hunger for identity and purpose, meaning filled by the kinds of things that used to fulfill that hunger in past generations: faith, patriotism, hard work, family, whatever it is. As those factors decline in modern American life, we still are left with this hole and this hunger for purpose that leaves us vulnerable to being told that we go to Ben and Jerry's and order a cup of ice cream with a cup of morality on the side, and somehow that's going to fill our moral hunger, when in fact, we hunger for more substantial fare. We don't want just fast food. We want something more meaningful. And I think that we as a conservative movement have not stepping up to fill the void that creates the black hole vacuum that allows the rest of the poison to actually fill the void: wokeism, scientism, postmodernism, whatever it is. We can do as much as we want of hammering that out once it shows up, but it's going to keep coming back in a new form until we fill that void with something more meaningful. And to me, faith is an interesting place to start. That starts in the family. That's also above my pay grade. But where I focus, at least as citizens, where we can begin, is to fill that void of shared national identity and civic identity. I think that starts in our schools with the next generation. And I think we have a clock. I think the clock is roughly the kids who are entering first grade today. If they graduate from 12th grade before the time we fix that problem, I think we lose a generation. I think if we lose a generation, I think we've lost the experiment. But that's the window we're working with right now. I think common language is clearly on that list. And you know what I would say? Language is one of the few things that binds us together as a people. And that's why you should be especially alert to anyone who wants to change that language. Because if you think about it, preferred pronouns, this, that, the other thing. If everyone who didn't like one small part of a language had the opportunity to change the language, then we would not have a language left. And at the end of the day, language is one of those few things that binds us together as a culture and as a society. I think it's our shared commitment to certain norms that brought the country together. It was a divided polyglot group of people 250 years ago that came together and launched this thing called the United States of America. Basic ideas like free speech and willing to walk the walk as conservatives to say that, I may disagree with you, but I will defend to the death your right to say it, because that's part of the premise on which our shared nation was built, as long as I get the same courtesy in return. And without using economic force to mess up those principles either, to say that you shouldn't actually be forced to choose between putting food on the dinner table and speaking your mind freely, between the American dream and the First Amendment. You get to enjoy both of those things at once. That is part of what it means to be American. So waking up those kinds of ideals that bind us together as one people, let's do that more as conservatives and take every unit of energy we spend in just criticizing the other side. There's so much to criticize. Let's reinvest some of that energy to filling that national void, that black hole, that void of meaning and purpose and identity in the next generation.
Here's another question, Vivek.
Hi, I'm Patty. I'm in the Loveland area. I'm maybe somebody that isn't from Avondale, but anyway, as you've been talking, I had made an analogy. You were talking about the shareholders aren't really the shareholders.
Yep.
As you were talking about that, the analogy I made was the parents of kids aren't really in control of kids, having been involved in a lot of the education situation for many years back when Common Core was implemented and trying to fight that. I'm going to pose just the observation, and I would love your comment on it. The observation is when you were talking about just the answer to this comment, getting people engaged and getting the millennials engaged to act, that is what I found was the biggest challenge. We could talk till we're blue in the face, but people need to take action. And what's frustrating for those of us who have done the research, who have put our necks on the line, who have stood up in board meetings, who have gone to Columbus and stood up, whether it's the education thing or the financial thing, my observation is it actually, we are not in control of our kids, because based on observation firsthand. What do we do about, like, how, from your generation, from your standpoint, my kids are grown. Thank God I don't have kids in high school or grade school anymore. If they did, they would not be going to public school. So how do we engage parents today who are in their 30s, who are not as willing to put their necks out? What do you see as the trigger, whether it be about the woke culture in business or education? Thank you.
Thank you. So education is hard. I don't have all the answers there. I do think that there is this native impulse, though, that the left has done a really good job of channeling, which is people who are in their 30s, who have kids now, they still have this moral hunger and void that I think if we can fill that void with a different affirmative alternative vision, rather than just saying no critical race theory, but to define what a vision for civic education looks like, I think it satisfies some of that hunger and some of that impulse in a way that dilutes the other agenda to irrelevance. Because I think sometimes the more we take a hammer to it, the more you actually inflame it, versus go the other route towards think about what civic education entails, what an education about American history entails, what an education about parts of American history that aren't being taught entail. Magnifying that automatically dilutes the other agenda, which I think is actually a much more effective way to do it, that engages parents who might be, push come to shove, even conflicted in their own impulses, their own voices in their head about what they're supposed to do. On the financial and the market side, look, I think that we're at the front end of many businesses being set up. The business that I'm setting out to build, or that vertical, I haven't even started to do. It's a vision, but that's what I've kind of decided that I'm going to make my calling. But I hope other people make other verticals their calling. And there, the thing that hopefully draws people into it, bluntly, can be economic opportunity. There's no shame in the American capitalist system to say that actually, if I serve people with goods and services and messages they want, I can make a lot of money by doing it. I think that might actually be easier because there's at least a natural impulse that draws leaders and entrepreneurs and CEOs to the table to help solve that problem. So there it's going to be easier. The schools are harder, but that's my view for each.
Here's a question.
Hi, I'm Rose Lee. You could call me Rose. I'm from Cincinnati, East Price Hill, a really cosmopolitan neighborhood. And that's what I asked for. I came from New York. And I asked my children to find a place for me that's more cosmopolitan. And they found it. They found it. And I love it. I was a parochial school teacher. I taught language arts and social studies. and I have something else to say, but this came to my mind. It was Dr. Martin Luther King's dream, totally integrated. All races, and we were there, and we didn't look at the children as from having rich parents or poor parents, which a lot of the public schools do, by the way. But they're all children of God, okay? And with God-given talents, and we have to help them find their God-given talents and help them develop their talents. And they will grow and they will be prosperous. And I just wanted to say about the dark money, Blackrock, they have violated their fiduciary responsibilities. And I know that they should be prosecuted for that. So I have legal background too, and that's the way I'm looking at it. It has to be a multi-front, a multifaceted way of attacking them. And in the end, okay, when all the folks that make up America realize that all this wokeness and stuff is against their interests, and what's in their interest is that we all lock arms because we're all American, okay? Then we will vanquish them. That's all I have to say.
Vivek, we have a couple questions online in the back. Oh, did you have from online? Yes.
Okay.
Unless, did you have a comment? I'm sorry. Did you have a comment you wanted to make back to Rose?
The comments, and I think
Yeah.
that, the one thing I would say when you talk about Martin Luther King, words that we might remember, wants us for children to be born in a country where they're judged not on the color of their skin, but the content of their character. The question I would ask for any civil rights movement today, and I'd encourage you to ask it of anyone in a racial movement or a gender movement or a sexual orientation movement, is this: what are you supposed to do when you actually reach the promised land? One of the things Dr. King said is, I can see the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I can see the promised land. I think the problem came up actually when the movement that he led and created long after he died did reach the promised land. And my advice to any civil rights movement, any rights movement, even to our movement, when we get there too, is the way I judge a movement is not how it behaves in defeat, but how it behaves in victory. And once you've won, the thing you're supposed to do is to celebrate it and then move on and find something else to do, or else you risk becoming the new oppressor that's far more oppressive than the one-time oppressor you were fighting against. That's what I will say.
Thank you. In the back.
Vivek, just so we have a full studio here. We have the gallery, and so that we have very close to the same number of people listening online.
Well, thanks. We'll take some questions from online.
We have a question from an online listener asking if you think it would make any difference if conservatives and libertarians all over America sold individual shares in companies such as Disney to vote with wallets against this agenda, which is against our children.
That's not my preferred approach, actually. I wouldn't want people to have to take the boycott approach to their investments, because it may be that many, especially in the technology industry, just because of the gains to scale, companies that are behaving in ways you don't want them to sometimes may end up being profitable and successful companies. I think the opposite approach is actually more promising, not to be divested, but to be invested in the market and to be able to make sure that with that investment comes your voice and your vote. And just make sure that the people who are investing your money don't represent a voice and a vote in the boardroom that depart with your interests. So no doubt, I think there will be others who have different philosophies. And I think there's room for healthy debate. Some may say, divestment is the way to go. I don't want $1 of that in my portfolio. I kind of think about it a little bit differently. I think that the problem, for example, with energy in this country is not that BlackRock divested from Exxon. It's that they invested in Exxon and told Exxon not to be an oil company, effectively, to decrease oil production 25% year on year. Think about what that means for gas prices at the pump today. Think about for the impact that that has on people who would have been invested in a company that would have been more successful than it would have been. I think that's the right way to think about this. Is the other side isn't divesting or boycotting, they're investing. So I think the point of actually making sure that your voice and your vote actually matter, that's kind of the philosophy that I see, going forward. And I hope that there are many other competitors who step up and see that opportunity, such that it's not just one or two people in a counter movement. I hope there are tens or hundreds of other firms formed to be able to tackle that vacuum and that opportunity.
We also have someone who wrote in, not with a question, but letting you know that she sent a link to this webinar with Vivek tonight to her whole email list. And the header on her email says, "This man should run for office."
Oh, thank you. That's very nice. I appreciate that. Look, there's a lot of ways to have impact. There's some important races in Ohio. The only thing I would say for our culture is that there's a lot of levers to pull. Some of them are in politics. Some of them are through nonprofits. Some of them in our schools. Some of them are in our economy and our culture and in media and in the investment world, for that matter. And so I just think that this is a multi-front battle that goes beyond politics, but I take that as a compliment.
For a couple short questions.
The last two, Dan, if that works.
Here's one right here.
Hey, Barbara. Okay, Rose. Barbara's back here. And so is, okay. I want to know, where does Donald Trump fit into all of this?
So, I mean, where should he fit in, or where does he? I don't know where he does fit in, because that's going to be his decision to make as to whether he, runs for office or not. I had dinner with him maybe last fall, I want to say. I left that with being entirely unsurprised if he does want a future political life. But, that's a question for him, not for me. I think that judging on his accomplishments, I personally find a lot that's hard to argue with. There's not a lot that I would have wanted done differently by way of results in those 4 years than I would want to be done differently in nearly every way in the last 15 months. Now, I think that's a different question from did he do a great or even outstanding job as president? Is still a different question from at the right path forward for the country. And one of my critiques of President Trump is actually not one that you may hear from others, but it's my critique of him, is that he said he wanted to drain the swamp. He said he wanted to ultimately get rid of the managerial rot in the federal government. That was the right vision, okay? And full disclosure of the obvious, I've done that job. It strikes me as a very difficult job, okay? So take my criticism in that context. I'm not promising you that I or anyone else I know would have done any better, but he didn't actually do it. The FBI that reported into him refused to vet his own nominees for the federal government. He complained about it to the press corps. He didn't actually do anything to solve the problem. Anthony Fauci stood by his side. He complained about Anthony Fauci to the press corps. He could have fired Anthony Fauci if he didn't like his policies. He didn't actually do it. And I think that the right leader for the conservative movement, this is not for a Senate race or for a House race or anything else, but for the president of the United States, right president of the United States, who is a conservative nominee, I'm going to use the word Republican, conservative nominee for president of the United States, has to go in there with an agenda to say there's exactly one way you fix a managerial rot inside an illegal administrative state, per the earlier question. There's not through incremental reform. It is not through budget cuts. It is not through putting a figurehead on top who you delegate the job to. It is through shutting it down. Close the doors.
Vivek.
Raise it to the bottom. And then if it's an essential function, build a new one in its place. That's fine. If it's a really essential function. But you can't do it through incremental reform.
Last question.
My name is Dave, and I'm too from Loveland. And thank you very much for coming out tonight. We really appreciate that. I have not read your book, so you may already be touching on this topic, but I wondered if you wouldn't provide like a brief commercial on ESG, the backbone of it, and what are some of the inherent dangers?
Yeah, so ESG stands for, and this is a good lead off to the future discussion I think you're going to have on the Great Reset, okay? So I'll give you one definition of the Great Reset that you can kind of put in the back of your minds for the talk that you're going to hear on it. And it's closely linked to ESG. The Great Reset refers to a vision for solving the world's problems that involve dissolving the boundaries between the public and private sector so that leaders in the public sector and the private sector can work together to implement their vision of the common good. And on the other side of the Great Reset is what I call the Great Uprising of everyday citizens who say, no, we as citizens in a democratic republic make those decisions ourselves. So that's what the Great Reset and the Great Uprising are about. ESG is a toolkit of the Great Reset. It is a scoring system. It's like a social credit system that effectively uses the private sector to implement certain social and political goals under the rubric of environmental, social, or governance agendas that effectively tell companies to do the kinds of things that governments used to be responsible for: fighting climate change, dismantling historical systemic racism in the United States, a range of other social agendas such as fighting transphobia, whatever it may be, using companies as the vehicle to adopt that using a scoring and rubric system that ESG offers for implementing that vision. So that's what the ESG vision for capitalism is. So if the Great Reset and you got the Great Uprising, what's on the other side of ESG? That's what I call a vision for excellence capitalism. So ESG is one vision, which is companies ought to focus on not just providing products and services to people who need them, but also advancing other social and political agendas. The alternative vision is to say that no, companies should focus exclusively on making excellent products and services for their customers and leave everything else to the political process. So that's not offering a value judgment, that's just descriptively what it is. I do think that ESG is one of the most, now the value judgment, I think is one of the most dangerous forces and pernicious forces in American life, because like a virus takes over a cell to replicate itself, this virus has taken over American capitalism to say that actually, if we couldn't dismantle capitalism politically, let's dismantle capitalism using capitalism itself to do it. It's like a virus preying on a host. And if we don't wake up to it, I think that's going to ultimately spell the death of the host itself.
Let's thank Vivek. Let's thank Vivek for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Dan.
So good to have you. Stick with me a minute. Thank you. So just before we leave, I forgot to mention one very important person who's in the room tonight, and I wanted to have her stand, and that's someone who helped me start EmpowerU 12 years ago. That's Nita Thomas. Would you stand up? Oh, stand up. Come on. So as Vivek remembers signing all the books that I ordered from you, when I got my first one, it arrived separately, and there was something inside the book that just left me with it just impacted me so much. And what it said, and I've kind of co-opted a little bit, so sorry. It said, Daniel, speak freely, empower you. And I just think it's been something for the last 6 months that at every stretch, I've tried to remember you need to speak freely what's on your mind. So if you'll bear with me, I wanted to give you a little Empowered Citizen Award tonight.
Oh, thank you.
And this is to Vivek Ramaswamy for inspiring citizens to speak freely. You are an empowered citizen.
Thank you. Thank you. This is honor.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
And we're just so glad to have him here. And let's all go out tonight and think about what Vivek said. And I'll be sending you the memo about how you buy your first shares of stock.
No.
And
he's just kidding about that.
No, we don't want to get into any SEC problems, right? So go out, everybody. EmpowerU. Thank you so much for coming. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, let's do it. Let's right back here before you get sworn. Sounds good. Can you hold up that,
Yep.
that plaque? Oh, sure. That'd be great. Thank you.